Detective James Cooper stood at the iron gates of Blackwood Manor. The old house looked even more mysterious in the fog. Last night, the wealthy owner of the house, Mr. Richard Blackwood, had disappeared without a trace. "Detective, thank you for coming so quickly," said Mrs. Harrison, the housekeeper, as she opened the gates. Her hands were shaking as she led him inside. "It's terrible. Simply terrible." The detective followed her through the grand entrance hall. Everything looked perfect and in place, too perfect, he thought. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, taking out his small notebook. Mr. Blackwood had dinner at exactly 7 p.m., as he always does. He went to his study to work on some papers. At 10 p.m., I brought him his evening tea, but Mrs. Harrison's voice trembled. He wasn't there. The window was open, and his papers were scattered all over the floor. Detective Cooper walked into the study. The room was large, with tall bookshelves and a heavy wooden desk. He noticed 3 interesting things right away: the open window, a broken teacup on the carpet, and muddy footprints leading to the window. "Who else was in the house last night?" he asked. "Only the usual staff," Mrs. Harrison replied. "Myself, the gardener, Mr. Thomas, the cook, Mrs. Wells, and Mr. Blackwood's secretary, Miss Porter." Cooper examined the footprints carefully. They were size 11, much larger than Mr. Blackwood's usual size 9 shoes. He also noticed something strange. There were no footprints leading away from the window outside. The detective interviewed each staff member. Mr. Thomas said he was tending to the greenhouse until 9 p.m. Mrs. Wells claimed she was cleaning the kitchen after dinner. Miss Porter mentioned she left at 6 p.m. before dinner. But something wasn't adding up. Cooper found a fresh cigarette stub near the greenhouse, the same expensive brand that was in Mr. Blackwood's study. Mr. Thomas had said he didn't smoke. Walking through the house again, Cooper noticed something else odd. In Mr. Blackwood's bedroom, the bed was made perfectly, but there was a small detail wrong. The pillow showed signs of recent use, and there was a faint smell of pipe tobacco, which only Mrs. Harrison smoked. The detective gathered everyone in the main hall. "I know what happened to Mr. Blackwood," he announced. "And I know who is responsible." Mrs. Harrison's face turned pale. Miss Porter looked nervous. Mr. Thomas stared at his feet. "Mr. Blackwood never disappeared," Cooper said. "In fact, he's still in this house, isn't he, Mrs. Harrison?" The housekeeper's shoulders dropped. "How did you know?" Several clues gave it away. The footprints by the window were too obvious, and they didn't lead anywhere outside. The cigarette near the greenhouse showed someone used it as a meeting place. But most importantly, the pillow in Mr. Blackwood's room showed signs of use, and it smelled of your pipe tobacco. Mrs. Harrison sighed. Mr. Blackwood needed to disappear for a while. He discovered someone was stealing from his company, and he wanted to catch them without being noticed. He asked me to help him hide in the old servants' quarters while he investigated. Just then, Mr. Blackwood himself walked down the stairs, looking embarrassed. "I apologize for the deception, detective, but I had to know who was taking company funds. And now, thanks to having eyes inside my own house, I do." He looked directly at Miss Porter, who burst into tears and confessed to the theft. Detective Cooper closed his notebook with a small smile. The case of the vanishing at Blackwood Manor wasn't a disappearance at all. It was a clever trap. And it had worked perfectly. As he walked back through the iron gates, Cooper couldn't help but admire Mr. Blackwood's plan. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to catch a thief is to disappear yourself. The morning fog was lifting now, and Blackwood Manor didn't look quite so mysterious anymore.